I don't usually give talks on the future of education. I've been an educator for my entire career, and I did spend some of it in educational technology in Silicon Valley, but I mostly lead workshops designed to teach futures thinking and futures literacy. As it turns out, though, I think that the future of education fundamentally needs us to change the way that we think about, talk about, and teach for the future. And that's really kind of my sweet spot. So let's go ahead and dive in, and we can see how this works and how we might change those things in service of the future of education and why we need to. So usually I start my workshops and open with a slide like this. And I ask my learners or my participants to fill in the blank here and just kind of complete the following sentence with the first thing that comes to mind. So the future is blank. Now there are lots of good answers here. You might say the future is digital, or the future is female. You might say that the future is bright, or surprising, or uncertain, or scary, or risky, or faster than you think. All of these are really good answers, and I encourage you to throw your own in the chat right now. And they're good in part because at some point or another, probably all of them will be correct. The future probably will be each and every one of those things at some point. And yet we can also see that some of these things are contradictory. And there will be times when the future can't seem to be both of them at once. But that actually underscores the first thing I think we need to recognize about the future. To update our futures thinking, we need to understand that fundamentally, the future is a paradox. And if you think about it, the future by definition is something that doesn't actually even exist. And yet, we know that it will be created, that we will build that future together out of pieces that already exist in the present, that we could see if only we knew how to look for them. Similarly, we know that the future is unknowable in its particulars, and yet it is also something that we must prepare for, plan for, and equip ourselves and our learners in the next generation to survive and thrive within. And that creates a really interesting, difficult challenge for educators. How can we prepare people for a thing that we don't know, that we don't fully understand? And there's actually something about the way that we think about the future that makes this uniquely difficult. And it's encapsulated in this paradox. And the idea is basically this, that we can only know with certainty our present position, where we are and how we're performing today. And anytime we project forward, we're looking forward into time and deeper into an uncertain future, into increasing uncertainty. And to do that projection, we rely mostly on past experience and an intuition of change that is largely linear, an expectation that tomorrow will not be that different from today, and that the future is a thing that we can plan for, that it exists as the singular future. This is what foresight experts often call the official future. The idea of what the world will be like that we're always designing against, that we're always preparing for. And that feels good. It allows us to feel effective in our planning and even in our education. And yet the problem with focusing on an official future and the idea that we can plan for it is that it tends to blind us to a wider range of probable futures, things that could happen, that are reasonably likely. And if they did happen, we would look back later and say, well, I should have seen that, or I could have seen that coming. And there's a wider range still of possible futures, all of the things that could happen, all of the things that we might do, build, design, or become. And our preferred future, the one that we would actually like to inhabit, might not be the one that we're building toward along that official future line. In fact, that preferred future might not even be one that we're aware of, because it exists so far outside of the narrow range of official futures that we're focused on preparing ourselves and our children to inhabit. And this, of course, raises a really interesting and important question, which is, how might we explore and enable preferred futures through teaching and learning? And I don't think that the answer is this, plugging our learners into ever newer and more immersive technologies at younger and younger ages. Now, I can appreciate the power and the potential of new tools and new platforms and teaching everyone to code. All of those are valuable, but they're not the whole answer. And I don't even think they're the best answer. And as it turns out, I think we might find something more like the appropriate and adaptive answer, or at least a better path forward, in another, actually lesser known book by the author of The Little Prince. In a book called Citadel, there's a famous passage that's often misquoted, but Saint-Exupéry relates that if you wanted to build a ship for going to sea or seafaring people to take you there, the essential thing is not to hammer away at all of the skills and the details of shipbuilding and navigation, but rather to instill a deep love and a wonder for voyaging at sea and what we might find and experience over the ocean. And I think there's actually something analogous that we can see about teaching and learning in and for the future. And I think tearing ourselves away from this focus on the tasks and the jobs and the roles and preparing people for those things might actually allow us to see a bigger picture of what's really important in terms of teaching people how to navigate uncertainty and embrace ambiguity. Think about it this way. If we look at the prospect of preparing people for the jobs of the future, it would be really important to know what those jobs are going to be so that we could design an education system around them effectively. But as it turns out, when we're pressed, we don't really know what those jobs are going to look like. In fact, there was a study, a report published by the Institute for the Future, which is a think tank in Silicon Valley, a few years ago. I think this was 2018. And they suggested at that time that something like 85% of the jobs that would exist in 2030 didn't yet exist today. And that might be kind of a crazy number, 85%, but I think fundamentally they're onto something here. And I dug up what you're looking at on this slide in a paper from a pair of social scientists. This was published in 2010. And they were envisioning 20 new careers that would exist by 2030 that didn't exist in the year 2010. And there's some interesting stuff. There are some things that, yeah, those have come to pass. Even some kind of depressing ones. Note quarantine enforcer in the bottom left. There are also some that maybe we're still waiting on. But we don't know if these are ever going to arrive. We also don't know how we would prepare people to succeed in these careers or to succeed in careers and roles that we haven't yet even imagined. Fundamentally, we don't actually know what kind of expertise will matter in an uncertain future. And that, I think, is a really important thing to acknowledge and to accept, to realize we don't know what expertise will matter, and that also there are no experts on the future who can tell us this. In fact, anyone who tells you they're an expert on the future is probably trying to sell you something. So I would be a little skeptical. And interestingly, expert shares a Latin root with the word experience, which handily suggests where we expect expertise to come from. Experience itself. And no one, of course, actually has experience of the future. And again, we don't know what kind of expert we would be looking for. We don't know what kind of expertise will matter. We don't know what kinds of expertise we need to build. So I would argue that we need to find new ways of creating experience of the future and also new ways of recognizing different forms of expertise. I argue that we need to break away from the narrow range of official futures and to break the stranglehold that the past seems to have on our future imagination. And I'm not alone in this. As the award-winning and multidisciplinary futurist Pupil Bish has put it, futures for all cannot be imagined by a few. We need to widen the scope of possible futures that we're considering, and we need to expand the conversation. Pupil's an excellent follow on social media. I threw her Twitter handle in there. She's also the founder of the Decolonizing the Future initiative, something that uses storytelling as a tool for shaping more inclusive futures. And she's traveled the world working to engage marginalized groups in imagining and designing for their preferred futures. She invites communities and learners into a conversation where their voices haven't been heard or recognized in the past, but might be critically needed to shape the kind of future that we want to inhabit. And what she realizes, and the way that she goes about this, is basically premised on the idea that futuring itself is a teachable, learnable skill, that we can build this into our education. And I know that this is true because I have friends working in the field, some really inspiring partners and mentors that I see doing this every day in their work. I'll introduce you to a few of them. This is Lisa K. Solomon. She's a dear friend, mentor, and colleague, and she's a designer in residence at the Stanford D School. And she partners there with the K-12 lab that works to bring material, tools, strategies from the design school into the K-12 classroom. She does phenomenal work there. And she also has a phenomenal network. She introduced me over the summer to these guys, Dr. Lonnie Brooks and Ahmed Best, who are futurists, educators, artists, and creators of a game called Afro-Rhythms for the Future. And over the summer, I got to work with Lisa to bring Lonnie and Ahmed and Afro-Rhythms to the design school to put on a workshop for educators who wanted to bring more futures thinking into their classroom. Now, Afro-Rhythms from the Future is a game designed to use structured imagination and collaborative storytelling to envision and explore radically different futures, preferred futures, democratic and equitable and anti-racist futures. Effectively, Afro-Rhythms is a world-building game that pulls you out of the present and away from your assumptions about what the future must be like, and instead pushes you to collaboratively construct a world by remixing elements of possible futures. And then to tell stories about the people who live in that world, who they are, how they thrive, what that world looks like, what the experience is, what that future actually feels like on a human level. And in this version that we played at the D School, we told stories through design of artifacts, so things that might exist within, define, or even enable that specific future. It was a ton of fun, and you can see some of the stuff that we imagined here on this slide. And the game amplifies and even liberates the imagination. It foregrounds the idea that if we cannot imagine and anticipate an alternative world, we cannot possibly hope to build it from where we are today. Afro-Rhythms is a game that recognizes that our uncertainty is actually a window onto possibility. Our uncertainty about the future opens up a space for creativity and imagination. It recognizes that the answers that we've had and the systems that we've designed historically aren't the only or necessarily even the best answers and systems possible. And that those answers and systems may not be adaptive and sustainable for the future. So we need to teach ourselves to imagine, envision, anticipate, and enable alternative possible futures to find our preferred future among them. I'll give you another example. This is also from the design school at Stanford. And this was something created by Carissa Carter and the teaching and learning team there. It's a game also called I Love Algorithms. And I Love Algorithms anticipates a future in which AI systems align with human values and feel representative of the full diversity of the human family and its variety of experiences. And that's a future vision that recognizes that technology is actually too important to be left to the technologists. It requires more voices in the conversation. And the I Love Algorithms card deck is a step in exactly that direction. It's designed to enable anyone, whether they're technical or not, to prototype with machine learning in low resolution. The card deck explains 6 common machine learning algorithms through a cartoon, a simple text description, and the styles of questions that we might ask the algorithm to help us explore. And what this does effectively through the set of activities built around using this card deck is that it lowers the barrier to entry for important conversations around how we design the technologies that we will then use to design the future itself. It helps us anticipate a world in which technology is in service of people and planet rather than the other way around. And that's a critically important project and one that we cannot overstate the importance of right now. Now, each of these futures education tools is designed to engage 2 amazing capacities of the human brain. And these are the things, I would argue, that give each of us such great potential as learners and leaders. One of these is very frequently remarked upon in education, and that's the capacity for reflection, to look back and learn from the past, to learn from experience, and even to reflect on how we showed up in that experience so that we might do better in the future. The other capacity actually concerns envisioning futures itself, and this is called prospection. This is the idea that we're uniquely capable of imagining possible and preferred futures and then thinking about how to work toward them. It's an incredible thing. It's pretty uniquely human. Now, I think that we have the opportunity as educators to bring these powerful capacities together in the learning experiences that we create. We can invite reflection on our prospection. We can learn to use our futures thinking to reframe the present, to to put today in the service of building a better tomorrow. And I want to close here with a kind of funny but perhaps instructive look back on a future from our past that might actually offer a useful perspective on the present. So right now we're going to engage in a little bit of reflection on prospection. We're going to bring these loops together. So this is an image from a famous set of panels that was created by some French artists in the late 19th and very early 20th century. And they were asked to envision the 21st century, right, from the vantage point of the dawn of the 20th. Now, looking at this panel, which was supposed to be the future of learning and education, we can see a lot of kind of funny things. And we can note the industrial trappings of the vision. You have the headmaster who's cramming books into this machine, and then there's a hand crank, and it is very quickly and efficiently delivering knowledge into the brains of these learners. And so I want you to note the emphasis here, the values of efficiency and optimization. Those really stand out. And I think this should encourage us to ask ourselves if we're actually so different with our profound focus on new technologies and new platforms today. A lot of that also is around efficient and optimal education. We're thinking a whole lot about the how, but maybe not spending enough time really trying to reimagine the what and the why of the future of education. We have an opportunity now collectively to build future empathy and to ask new and different questions, perhaps like this one. What does the future need? You can probably think of a lot of things. I encourage you to throw them into the chat. This is a great question to spend time with. And I'll offer one answer. Tomorrow's leaders will need to solve the problems that today's leaders couldn't see their way out of. And in some cases, problems that today's leaders even created or perpetuated. But today, we have the opportunity to become the educators that tomorrow's leaders will need us to be. And I hope you will join me in that. And I hope that you will reach out to me. I'm Jeffrey at possiblefutures.design. Shoot me an email. I'm very happy to share links to the resources that I talked about today. You can get that I Love Algorithms card deck. You can download a PDF version from the Stanford D School. You can play it with your learners. You can see the kinds of things that Lonnie and Ahmed are doing with Afro-Rhythms from the Future. You can think about how to bring structured imagination and collaborative storytelling into your classroom, and think about how you can enable your students to enable our preferred futures together. With that, I will just say, obrigado, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.